My beautiful mythical creatures, Ace here, he, she, back at you with another podfic. And we are doing Someone Like You by Barky Pasker on AO3, and it's chapter 16. And on with the chapter. Well, the link and the trigger warnings will be in the description, and now on to the chapter. Chapter 16. For the first time in weeks, Izuku walked into the gym at his normal time. Kamara was sitting at the front desk for once. Probably didn't have anything to talk about this morning, or had busy work to do. Izuku would have actually liked the distraction this morning. Now that he had his equipment, he just needed to get his license. He was planning to go to the police station this morning, but he was too nervous. That was partly the reason why he was at the gym in the first place. Another part was because he needed to get back into the habit of going. After lifting weights for about an hour, Izuku finished up his exercise with a 30-minute run. He had been working for a long time to increase the amount of time he could continuously sprint. 30 minutes was his comfortable time right now. He could go longer, but since he was just getting back into the swing of things and still had to go to the police station, he didn't want to get too out of breath. About 15 minutes after Izuku started his workout, the purple-haired guy from before had walked in the door and started out on the elliptical to warm up. Every time Izuku changed machines, so did he. Izuku caught him staring a few times. It looked like he wanted to say something, but he never so much as took a step towards Izuku. So Izuku decided that he was going to go about his business until the guy decided to say whatever it was he wanted to say. Izuku finished his run without any interruption and went into the locker room. Izuku heard the door open as he was starting his shower. He finished washing up, dried off, then donned his underwear before leaving his stall. He had a purple-haired, baggy-eyed visitor waiting for him when he got to his locker. But this guy still never said anything. He just stood there and watched as Izuku got dressed. He would have accused the guy of being a pervert if it wasn't for the fact he wasn't really looking at anything. He was staring straight ahead with a faraway look in his eyes. Izuku figured he was trying to figure out how he was going to start wherever it was he wanted to say. Izuku was tying up his shoes when he finally decided to say something. "Are you really quirkless?" he asked. Izuku paused for a second. Kamara said he was supposed to tell him if anyone talked about Izuku's quirk, or lack thereof. But there was something in the question. It didn't sound accusatory or derogatory. It sounded like the answer to the question would determine if the purple-haired youth continued into the light or fell into despair. "Yes," Izuku said honestly. "How did you do it?" the young man asked. "Do what? How did you get to look like you do?" Izuku tilted his head to the side, glanced at himself in one of the full-length mirrors that were hanging on the wall of the locker room. He hadn't really paid attention to his appearance, so he is not sure how much he had changed. But he did see that he looked lean. He also had defined muscles, but were not large like you would see on a weightlifter. Izuku felt like maybe he should have been offended because it was a similar question to what Kamara asked all those weeks ago, but it didn't feel the same. If anything, it almost seemed like the question was asked out of desperation, as if he was begging Izuku to tell him that he could do it too, to tell him how it was done in the first place. Although Izuku had to admit he didn't really see what the guy was talking about. He didn't extremely look impressive, but Izuku was not the type of person to purposely break someone down. But that made Izuku wonder. The young man was probably about his age. Based on experience, Izuku would guess the man wants to be a hero. There was almost no one his age who didn't want to be one. But what made him believe he couldn't be one? Also based on experience, it would have to be quirk related. But he wasn't quirkless, otherwise he would never have asked Izuku if he was. Izuku wouldn't ever meet anyone who was quirkless, but he would imagine that if he did, he would come out and say something like, "I'm quirkless too." That left the possibility that his quirk was undesirable. Emulator and transformation quirks usually left some sort of physical sign, like the guy who came into the cafe. His quirk dehydrated objects, so it caused his skin to dry up. This guy looked fairly normal, obviously no mutation quirk or any mutation whatsoever. There was no birthmarks or unusual designs on the skin. The most unusual thing about him was his hair that stood on end in the eye bags under his eyes. Izuku could tell his hair stood up on its own. The little hairs around the edge of the forehead, even dampened with sweat, were not held down. The only way to get the color under the eyes that dark was severe and chronic insomnia. All quirks affected their user in some way. Inko, for example, sometimes waved her hands in the air even when not actively using her quirk. Those observance points to him having a mental quirk. Those were incredibly interesting. Although they were considered emitter types, they really should be in a league of their own. They have very subtle indicators. This young man's hair could have easily been gelled, and the insomnia could be genetic, although Izuku is certain that's not actually the case. Gel would normally wash out with sweat, and if the insomnia was genetic, the age of onset wouldn't normally be that young. Mental quirks fell largely into two categories: those who affect the user and those who affect others. The two types were treated differently by society. The first one was treated like prodigies. The quirks normally made people smarter or have a unique skill that made them incredibly helpful to society. That was where Izuku fell. People at the cafe thought he had a quirk that basically made him smarter. Boy, would they be in disbelief if the truth ever came out. The second category was not treated well. If this person was using this gym and asking those types of questions, he would probably fall into this category. Izuku felt a pebble sink into his stomach, just enough to cause a bit of nausea. Why? Because he knew mental quirks that affect others would always be considered villainous, which is absolutely ridiculous. There was no such thing as a heroic or villainous quirk, but this evidently was only something that someone quirkless could see. "I worked hard," Izuku answered, and that sounded fake, like what rich people who got all their money from their parents would say when asked how they got rich. And I actually mean that. Izuku felt like he had to add on. "It took me nearly a year to get where I am today. I learned a lot from online forums and videos. I was lucky enough to find people who were willing to help me. The man scrunched up his face. I could help you, Izuku offered. I could get you in touch with a couple of friends of mine. He took his phone out of his pocket and pulled up Ojiro's contact. Izuku hasn't had a phone for long, but he was pretty sure it was poor etiquette to give out someone's number without asking first. So he sent a message asking just that. I go to a dojo ran by my friend's uncle. They accepted someone quirkless. I'm sure they would take someone with a villainous mental quirk, Izuku said offhandedly. Even if you could clearly hear the sarcasm in the last part of Izuku's statement, the purple-haired guy went rigid and glared at Izuku. How can you possibly know that? He sneered. It's quirk analysis, Izuku said casually. Something Izuku had only learnt recently is that when you tell someone he's quirkless and they treat it like it's no big deal, it makes Izuku feel normal, like he wasn't actually a freak of nature. He had never tried to do the same thing on someone else, so he wasn't sure if that was a response equal to him or if others feel the same way. It's what I do. Well, even if the response wasn't universal, it also seemed to work for the young man. The tension in his shoulders relaxed, and the glare softened, but he still looked at Izuku with suspicion. Ojiro texted Izuku back almost immediately, giving Izuku the okay to give out his number. He also mentioned that he would meet up with him sometime before school starts. My friend said it was okay for me to give you their number. Give me your phone. I'll put my number in and share the contact. The phone was handed over reluctantly. Izuku typed in his number into the new text message box and sent himself a message, then responded to the message on his own phone with Ojiro's contact. If it's okay with you, I want to save your contact information to my phone. Maybe we can text every once in a while? Izuku asked. Sure, I guess. Named Shinzo Hitoshi. I'm Midoriya Izuku. Izuku stood in front of the police station, working up the nerve to go inside. What if something had changed and there was no such thing as a crime fighting anymore? What if they just decided that they were going to allow him to do it? No, he couldn't think that way. He had worked hard for so long. No one had thought of getting rid of crime fighting as something important for decades. So there was no way they would have considered it any time in the last year. It was still possible. He could still do it. Izuku stepped through the door. He walked up to the front desk. I'm here to apply for the crime-fighting license, he told the officer working at the desk. They looked at Izuku with annoyance, but bent down, opened what sounded like a filing cabinet, and handed Izuku a piece of paper. Izuku took a pen from the cup sitting on the desk and began filling out the form. As far as the application went, this one had almost nothing to it. It literally asked him for his name, date of birth, phone number, and address. Izuku debated on which address to put down, his new one or his current one. In the end, he decided to put down his current one. If they needed to get in touch with him after he moved, he could just update it then. Other than the basic information, they only needed him to mark a box confirming he was quirkless and his signature stating he was aware of the risk and relieving the city of any liability in case of his death. He had halfway expected to need something more than that, like a test showing you knew the law or a physical assessment or something, but nope, that was it. Izuku handed the form back to the police officer. They looked over the form, then picked up a camera. He pointed at a blank wall. Izuku backed up to the wall and stood facing the officer. They took a picture with the camera, then went back to the computer, pushing a few buttons. In about 30 seconds, a license was being spit out of the printer. He handed the warm license to Izuku, then sat back down at his desk and went back to writing whatever report he was working on. Izuku looked at the license, his face staring back at him. Unlike heroes, crime fighters didn't have a code name. At least not officially, it seemed. Instead, he had an ID number identification. CF 2357. Who do I contact when I arrest a villain? Izuku asked the officer. The officer scoffed. As if you will actually be able to catch anyone without a quirk. Who do I contact when I arrest a villain? Izuku asked. Izuku repeated. The officer sighed, opened up a drawer behind him. He pulled out a pamphlet out and threw it on the desk. It slid right off when Izuku quickly caught it. He opened it and found a list of phone numbers, one for each precinct in the city. You can call whichever is closest, but don't even bother. It's not as if any of them will waste their time to come pick the villain up anyways. How is arresting a villain a waste of their time? It's literally their job. Look, kid, no judge is going to touch a case brought in by someone quirkless. If you catch any villains, they are just going to be your buddies, trying to make you look good. It's a waste of time to try to convict someone who didn't actually commit a crime. Not to mention the fact that the HPSC made an annulment that little loophole you're trying to use. What annulment? You have to have significant evidence to prosecute at the time of arrest. There is no way someone like you will be able to get that. Izuku felt a righteous anger form in his gut. We'll see about that. He walked out of the precinct, phone in hand. He needed to call Hatsume. It was time to make some revisions to his costume. The officer took Izuku's form to the back office. He knocked on the detective's office door. I have a crime fighter form for you to file, he said. Detective Sakauchi looked up from the case he was working on. A crime fighter form? Why didn't you stop them? You know what actually happens. What's the point? I gave him the pamphlet. I did my job. If the kid wants to die, then just let him die. It's better for the gene pool. The officer walked away back to his desk. What the officer said struck a chord with Sakauchi. It wasn't right. No police officer should say something like that. Unfortunately, he didn't have the power to do anything. But he knew who did. Sakauchi picked up his phone and pressed speed dial number 5. The phone rang a few times before being cut off. Sakauchi, to what do I owe the pleasure of speaking with you today? Did you finally catch that bank robber? Hello, Chief. No, not yet. We are still trying to corner them in an area without any electricity. I can see how that would be difficult to accomplish. Yes, well, I'm actually calling today on a personal problem. Oh? What seems to be the problem? I had someone quirkless come in and fill out the crime fighter application. The officer working at the front desk didn't even try to stop them. You know what usually ends up happening? And then he comes to me and says that we should just let the kid die? That is not the kind of attitude that should be allowed as in a police officer. Did he say anything like that to the applicant? Well, I don't know for sure, but I don't believe so. And he gave the applicant the pamphlet? He said he did. then there's nothing I can do. We can't punish someone for their personal opinions, not unless they say it to a civilian and the civilian complains. Everyone has their own opinions, whether they are right or wrong. If we fire every police officer that isn't a saint, we wouldn't have any police officers. I guess, Sakauchi said, then hung up the phone. He was not at all satisfied. Even if the police officer couldn't be fired, he believed they should have some sort of repercussions to show that that type of thinking was not acceptable. He had always believed Chief was like him, someone who believes everyone was deserving of justice. That was the entire reason he became a police officer in the first place, to help people who were not able to help themselves. But Sakauchi had a sneaking suspicion the chief was less like him and more like the officer working at the front desk, just less forward about it. Sakauchi picked up the folder with the application form. What's done is done. The least he can do is make up for his co-worker's lack of sympathy, is to make sure the kid is at least looked out for when he's on the street. Sakauchi opened the file and stared into the eyes of the analysis. His jaw dropped. There was no way that's who the application is. There's no way he was quirkless. It's well known that he has an analysis course. Or is it? None of the advancements, nor do the analyst himself ever mentioned actually using a quirk. Sakauchi opened up the quirk registry and sourced it. He needed to double check. His disbelief turned to wonder. He couldn't find him anywhere in it. He was actually just that smart. It was incredible. Horror grew in his ribcage. Sakauchi quickly opened the drawer of his filing cabinet and began looking for the paperwork for confidential information. He was very much aware how the quirkless population was thought of by the general public in the justice system. When they found and arrest the bank robber, he will have to turn in all his evidence over to the judge. The defending attorney will have unlimited access to it. The whole case could be dismissed if it was discovered the break in the case came from someone quirkless, let alone someone who is quirkless and unproven. If the quirkless person had a track record of successful convictions, it could be argued by the prosecutor that the information came from a reliable source. Right now, Midoriya didn't have that as a quirkless person. He has a track record as someone with an analysis quirk. But as soon as it gets out that he's quirkless, that track record goes down the drain. Until he had that back again, Sakauchi had to protect him any way he could. Now that he knew who the applicant was, he had no doubt Midoriya would succeed as a crime fighter. He had the smarts, that's for sure. That wouldn't stop Sakauchi from looking out for him, though. Sakauchi started filling out the paperwork. He had to make Midoriya a confidential informant. It would prevent him from being able to tell people who he got the information from, and if they caught the robber before Midoriya had a proven track record, it would prevent either lawyer from being able to call him as a witness. But if someone found him and discovered that he had interfered with an official investigation that resulted in someone being put into Tartarus, There is no doubt in Sakauchi's mind that he would be hunted and killed. He just didn't know who would get to him first, the heroes or the villains. And that is it for chapter 16. Chapter 16. Chapter 17 is up next. And as always, I'm going to do what I always do. Chapter 17. It took 2 days for Inko to discover the money was gone. Izuku had just gotten home from the gym. Well, until next time, my beautiful mythical creatures, peace out. Stay hydrated and eat donuts. Bye bye.